Chapter 9. The Church of the Blessed Transfiguration was not grand, but it was big enough to require a public address system. It was not the kind of church that lavished attention on stained glass windows or altar dressing or brass zibzobs or painted statues of Jesus. It was a modest church with a very good public address system. That was the first thing Father Fisher bought when he became pastor. And the congregation was pleased because that way they could catch every word of his stirring sermons or his funny homilies full of memorable analogies. It was such a good public address system that it never squeaked or buzzed. It made the pastor's rich baritone voice sound like he was sitting right beside you, talking to you alone, which kept the children and their parents attentive. Jim felt strange being back. He hadn't been to church since last Easter, and his Sunday clothes didn't fit so well anymore. He had grown a lot since then. He had grown a lot in the last week, grown to realize that church might be a good place for him to go after all. Folks at the church smiled and greeted him with sympathy hands and condolence eyes, but for all that, it was almost worth going just because of how happy it made his mother. She hadn't pushed him. She hadn't said anything more to him about the church helping them out financially and how nice it would be for him to return the favor. What she didn't know was that he had his own reasons for showing up at the Blessed Tea, something more than worship on his mind. Ruth Rose had horrified him with her rendition of his father's death at the hands of Fisher, but no matter how deranged it sounded, he couldn't shake the vision from his head. It was as if he had been at sea for a year and she had thrown him this wrecked bit of flotsam, something to grab onto. He had no idea where it was carrying him, but somehow she had stopped him from sinking. However little Jim cared to believe what she had said, Fisher had lied to him about a mystery book, about it being a coincidence that they had met outside the library when the pastor had known Jim was going to be there all along. It wasn't much, but if he could lie about such things, then maybe he could lie about a tube of lip balm. He could say he lost it while on a search party in an area where he wasn't supposed to have been searching, when, in fact, he might have lost it a lot earlier, walking away from Hub's car in the Cedar Grove, in Hub's clothes, just as Ruth Rose had said. Was she as crazy as Father made her sound? The church filled up slowly. Organ music played in the background. There was no organ. The Blessed Tea wasn't that kind of church, but the very good PA system had a tape deck. Tepid sunlight painted the pale church walls. Jim kept turning in his seat to see who was entering the church. Nancy Fisher arrived in her wheelchair, pushed by a member of the congregation. Jim stared at the door, hoping Ruth Rose might follow, the good daughter. Her mother took her station beside the last pew by the wall so as not to be in anybody's way. She was dressed in a colorful blouse and a bright blue pleated skirt. She looked cheery enough. She smiled a lot. People came over to say hello, and she chatted with each person in a nice, subdued way. But as soon as they left, Jim noticed that her face fell and her eyes went neutral. There were pouches under her eyes, as if she didn't get much sleep, and her hands in her bright blue lap held on to each other tightly. Poor Nancy. From the vestry at the back of the church, the old sexton, Dickie Patterhue, appeared and turned off the organ music tape at the PA control panel. The congregation took their seats and stopped talking, and then Father Fisher appeared from the vestry in a cassock that was almost the same blue as his wife's skirt. He wore a starched white collar, but apart from his cross of glinty green rock, nothing fancy. Nothing to draw a person's attention from his smooth and handsome face and his neatly combed, lustrous black hair. He began with a Bible reading. Everyone was supposed to be praying, but Jim noticed that a lot of the congregation glanced at the pastor. The people of the Blessed Transfiguration were so proud of him. He was the first homegrown boy to make it to pastor, and it was generally considered that he could have gone to a much larger parish in a much grander place. No, he had said, when God spoke to him, he told him he must stay right there amongst his people. The congregation was glad about that, and they were smug, too, because the other churches in town, which were bigger and older and fancier, didn't have a pastor who could hold a candle to their own Father Fisher when it came to preaching the word of the Lord. And no wonder. He was a man who'd been saved from the fires of hell and was thankful every day for his salvation. Every child who grew up at the Blessed Tea knew the story of how their pastor had been called to the sacred ministry. To Jim, it had always sounded like a legend or something, and he had never questioned it. just the way he had never really known that his dad and Father Fisher grew up together right there on the 12th line. It was as if the story told at church and the real story were cards in two separate piles. In the watery light filtering through the tall, plain windows of the church, with the farmer of souls leading his cattle in song and prayer, Jim sat and began, for the first time, to try to shuffle the deck together. Fisher was the son of a shrewd and godless farmer, so the legend had it. Wilfred Fisher had become rich, capitalizing on the misfortunes of his neighbors. He had bought up half of North Blandford Township, and the young Eldon showed every sign of following in his father's money-grubbing ways. Gifted with money and a clever mind, he had gone off to university to study business administration and take over the Fisher empire. He had got as far as his initial year with top honors, and that's when the Spirit of the Lord moved in him. The voice of the Lord spoke to him and told him to leave behind the ways of wickedness and go forth in the way of righteousness, as he had listened, forsaking his father's fortune and becoming a farmer of souls. We are all of us sinners, he was fond of saying, and I'm a great sinner, unworthy of God's love, worthy of only being trampled under his feet. He always sounded so proud saying that. God, it seemed, had shown compassion, that had seen fit to shine his light upon him. There was a picture that some child had drawn in Sunday school. It was part of the unofficial legend of Father Fisher, a comic strip showing Father wrestling with a devil in a cave, the devil overpowering him and laughing in his face, and God's finger lighting a nearby torch that Father Fisher could thrust into the face of the devil. The child had colored it with pencil crayons. He had made the cave all shadowy and the devil fire engine red. The fire had been yellow and orange, and the Sunday schooler had broken his pencil, making Father Fisher's hair black. The Sunday school teacher had urged the young artist to give it to the pastor. It was hanging in the basement meeting room even now, years later. From what Jim knew, Fisher had lived just up the road from him. Jim had never seen Wilfred Fisher, the godless capitalist of the story. They had never talked about him at home. Was he the devil? Had father actually fought his own father? Who was to know? That was the problem with Sunday school stories. Who was to know which parts were real? And what were the sins that made Father Fisher such a great sinner? Were they real sins, or did he mean he was a bad person because he was just human, the son of Adam? Father's voice suddenly cut into Jim's thoughts. He had mounted the pulpit, and Dickie Patterhue from his control station at the back of the church had turned on the pulpit mic. "Let us pray," said the pastor. Everybody bowed their heads, but as Jim bowed his, he heard the sound of the entrance door opening. He turned to look. It was her. She was dressed all in black, like a thief. Jim glanced over to where Nancy Fisher was sitting in her corner. She had seen her daughter too. For a moment her face lit up, and then, just as quickly, she paled. Jim's gaze returned to Ruth Rose. She was standing perfectly still, her head bowed, her hands folded in front of her. She looked humble, as if she were praying along with the rest of the congregation. But there was something in her hand, something dark. For one horrible instant, Jim thought it was a gun, but it was too small. Jim snapped his head back to look at the pastor. If Father had seen Ruth Rose, he showed no signs of it. And then Jim figured that from the pastor's angle up high, he probably couldn't see her under the lower roof of the narthex. Father Fisher's head was bent solemnly in prayer, and his voice did not falter. Jim dared to look back at Ruth Rose. She was sidling along the back wall of the church. Her mother was watching her intently with a frightened look in her eyes, her hands grasping the rims of her wheelchair. What was going on? Jim's mother touched his arm and gave him a look that he hadn't seen in years. It was a "quit squirming around in your seat" look. Jim faced the front again, but as the pastor finished his prayer and asked the congregation to please be seated for the sermon, Jim managed another quick glance towards the back. Ruth Rose was nowhere to be seen. "The leaves are turning to glorious gold," began the pastor, "and we, Lord, call it fall." Slowly, so as not to draw his mother's attention, Jim turned his head to the right until he could see Nancy Fisher. Her eyes were riveted on something happening on the other side of the church. Jim carefully returned his attention to the front, glanced at his mother to see if she was watching, and then very cautiously turned his head to the left until he could see all the way to the back. He could see Dickie, the sexton, the only person in the back row. He was seated, but his head was bowed in prayer, or so it seemed. Upon further inspection, Jim was quite certain that the sexton was dozing. Behind him, Jim caught a glimpse of black. It was Ruth Rose. She must have ducked down behind the last pew. We see in the fallen leaves, the bare trees, the end of things, death. But the Lord in his boundless wisdom has seen fit to give busy Mother Nature a break, a nap, that's all. The beautiful maple isn't dead, it's just having a little snooze. The members of the congregation chuckled and took the opportunity to make themselves more comfortable in their seats. In the resulting racket, Jim caught sight of Ruth Rose again. She had dashed behind the wooden podium that housed the controls of the public address system. Suddenly he knew what he'd seen in her hand, an audio tape. His mother nudged him and frowned. Obediently, Jim looked towards the front. Come spring, as we all know, the sap will run again. The gold of the fall will have been distilled. We will see it again, taste it again. And oh, how sweet it is, that golden syrup of which Lanark County is so justly famous. It is elixir, the elixir of rebirth. Jim heard this sentence, but there was something wrong. The sound had gone off. He was hearing Father Fisher's voice live. The pastor himself hadn't noticed yet. He went on sermonizing while all over the church people could be straining to hear, looking around, wondering what had gone wrong. And then there was another sound, a hissing sound. And at last, Father realized something was wrong. He tapped the mic. There was no sound, just a hissing that seemed to fill the church. Father Fisher strained to see the sexton, who was snoring now, oblivious to the commotion. Then the hissing was replaced by the sound of moaning. The congregation held its breath in hushed anticipation. The moaning sounded like that of a grown man. What followed was unmistakably a grown man. "O God," groaned the voice, "you have revealed your great plans for me, and I am your faithful servant. Help me, Lord, I beseech thee. Keep at bay those who would stop me, those who, filled with hatred, hound me." "Dickie," cried Father Fisher, straining on to see the sexton, "what in tarnation is going on?" The taped voice gave way to sobbing. "As thy transfigured Son, Jesus Christ, commanded his disciples on the mountain to keep what they had seen to themselves, may my sins be something just between us. Oh, most merciful God, I humbly beg of you." "Would somebody please wake Dickie?" said Father Fisher. But his other voice on the tape suddenly transformed into the voice of a youngster and said, Hub, it's okay, old buddy. Nobody's ever going to find out." A baffled murmur went up from the congregation. Jim felt his mother gasp and tense all over. Father Fisher in the pulpit raised his voice. "We seem to be having some technical difficulties," he said. A few people laughed nervously, and Father Fisher called out to his sexton loudly so that Jim, straining, couldn't catch the next bit of the tape. But he saw Father Fisher clutch the edge of the pulpit and lean out as if he was a sailor in the crow's nest who had just spotted an iceberg. "Mr. Patterhue, for heaven's sake!" One of the church elders who had hurried to the back yelled out, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" At which point Jim saw Ruth Rose sprint for the door and barrel into the elder, who grabbed her and held her up until she kneed him, and he doubled over in pain. The whole congregation cried out in astonishment. Jim by now was kneeling on the pew facing the back. He was astonished too, but for a quite different reason. He couldn't believe her boldness. His mother's hand was gripping his arm, but not to get him to turn around. She was hanging on to him for support. Her face was pale. "If you heard the stuff he says, maybe you'd begin to understand." That's what Ruth Rose had said to him. The tape stopped at last, and there was a sigh of relief from the congregation. But somebody was not relieved. Nancy Fisher, alone in her wheelchair, suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream.